Today, I want to talk about horror games. Specifically, I want to talk about games that are horror walking simulators. And I think that there are so many of these games that exist out in today that we really need to take a look back at, see really what the golden age of horror walking simulators was, or at least what I think that they were. And so let's take a dark, creepy, and probably insane stroll down memory lane to review some of the best horror walking simulators that really defined the genre as we know it to this day. Of course, you might be thinking to yourself, hey Marks, isn't it technically like haunted house simulators? And I do agree that these really do fall into the same category, but I want to stay away from the haunted house nomenclature because it feels like it just leans a little bit too heavy into kind of campy creepiness, where there's a lot of just jump scares and that's the only really thing that is important in these games. And so when I'm talking about horror walking simulators, I'm talking about games that you can't really fight back, the ones that you really have to run away in order to finish your objective, otherwise you die. Of course, they do pull elements of like isolation, of fear, of tension, atmosphere, all of that type of stuff, kind of lifted out of just the horror franchises in general, but there is a really big emphasis on that feeling of helplessness, that you're not able to actually fight back, and you just gotta really do what you can in order to survive the ordeal. And so with that, let's go back to 2010 when Frictional Games introduced the world to Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Now, the premise for this game was really simple. You wake up in a castle, you don't know what's going on here, and really you just gotta get out of there. That's the only thing you really have to do. But oh wait, there are just unnamed horrors roaming the halls that can kill you in one hit, and you're locked inside of this castle with said unknown horror, and so that really just makes things a little bit more inconvenient for yourself. It was a game that was incredibly simplistic in its design, and really had the player relying on sound and sight to be able to know how to stay alive, forcing that level of immersion into the game, because if you wanted to make it through it, you had to be paying attention to what was going on around you and how your environment was changing. And really what made this game so good was really its atmosphere. It was creepy, isolating, grandiose, and it felt very in line with some of the best horror movies of all time, like Alien or The Shining, where you're trapped inside of this large area, and even though it feels so big, you feel so small and trapped with this unknown factor that could just take you out in a second. And another factor that actually made this even more terrifying was this whole idea that if you were actually hiding, because, you know, obviously the monster can see and stuff like that, so you have to hide in the darkness, but if you're hiding in the darkness, it actually increases your insanity, warping your vision and sound. And so those two things that you're really relying on in order to track where the monster is and where you can stay safe get distorted. You can't even trust your own senses on that, so you're really trying to make it through it while the game is actively working against you. Of course, also too, you're in this dark castle that slowly morphs, slowly changes, becomes even more grotesque in its nature. Like there's these blobs that just kind of pop up all over the wall, and it's got this gothic horror, dark environment where you don't know what exactly is going on. They really just went hard into the atmosphere, and I think that is one of the main reasons why this is such a great horror game. And why Amnesia: The Dark Descent is such an important game too is it really set the formula for how these horror walking simulators are going to operate and laid the groundwork for every single game in the future to more or less look at Amnesia and be like, they nailed their horror game, we want to do something similar to that. Of course too, when I think back on Amnesia, I think the moment that stands out to everybody, but of course when I first played it through, I was in high school, and there's that one part with the water monster where it's actually invisible and you just have to escape through the hallways, and then there's the second one, and usually you can hop on these boxes or get out of the water, but you just gotta run as fast as you can down this hallway to reach the other end while you just hear the water just going crazy behind you, knowing that these monsters are coming and hunting you. That level of tension and horror I don't think I've ever experienced in a game previous to that moment, and it's still like, I still remember that every single time I talk about Amnesia. But okay, let's go forward a couple years into the future to talk about our second game that really helped define the genre, and it was a fun little indie game. You've probably heard of it, Slender: The 8 Pages. Now, this one was independently developed in Unity by Mark Hadley, and it really just embodied a cultural movement at the time, which was the whole creepypasta feel. In the game, very simple. You're stuck in this random forest, it's very dark, you've got a flashlight, and you're supposed to find 8 pages, while you have to escape from an increasingly aggressive teleporting monster known as Slender in this crazy big map. It relied on very simplistic horror elements. I mean, the darkness is the easiest one, but very cheap jump scares. And of course, the flashlight has batteries. Once you find out that the flashlight runs out of batteries, it's kind of one of those moments where you're just like, oh crap, I'm screwed. And the thing that really allowed Slender to be as big as it was the fact, honestly, that it was free for download. I talked a little bit about the whole creepypasta movement that was going on, where Slender was a game in that genre, but this thing was so easily downloadable that pretty much everybody could go and play this horror experience on their own. YouTubers everywhere were reacting to it and blowing it up. I mean, it was a cultural phenomenon, and it drew more attention to the creepypasta community, upon which they kind of clapped back, sending more people over to experience Slender. It really popularized the whole idea of these horror walking simulators, and quite frankly, allowed so many other indie horror games to really take off as well. I mean, Slender was like the original indie horror game if you think about it. And I'm not going to say that it was an extremely well-built game or it was the best thing ever made or anything like that, but it is hard to take away from just how of a novel, fun, shared experience that was going on the internet back in that day of playing Slender and going through the whole gauntlet basically of this thing just jump scaring the heck out of you. Even to when this thing released, I was in high school at this point, and I remember watching my other friends and getting them to play it at the same time and watching them kind of be jump scared by it. It was such a communal experience, and once again, made horror walking simulators just a little bit more popular. Which set the pavework for our next game to talk about. In 2013, Red Barrels releases Outlast. Now, in Outlast, you're an investigative journalist trying to expose some inhuman treatments of patients inside of a mental hospital. Only issue is, you kind of get locked in yourself with a bunch of homicidal patients who are all inside, while trying to uncover the dark mystery of what really was going off from the Murkoff Corporation inside of this space. Problem is, it's nighttime, and the only thing you really have to get yourself through it is your handheld camcorder, which does have night vision, so that's a little bit helpful. But that's about it, and you gotta go through this entire thing and try to escape alive. It was very similar to Amnesia in how the game was built, and honestly, Red Barrels even stated that they used Amnesia as like the main gameplay influence, but then looked at movies like REC and Quarantine to go for more of a found footage film with all of these horrors surrounding you. And this is where I think that Outlast really succeeded in the most. It took the foundation of Amnesia, and then going for that whole found footage horror aspect, it modernized a lot of those elements while keeping true to the Amnesia core. They essentially just turned up the production value around everything that was going on, but all of the good stuff about Amnesia is pretty much present in Outlast as well. And I actually really appreciated the way that it ramped up the feeling of isolation, because sure, Amnesia, you're trapped in this giant castle. Oh, Slender, you're trapped in this forest. But in Outlast, you were trapped in this giant mental institution. The only difference being that it's not you and one other monster, it's you and all of these other mental patients in this hospital where you don't know who's hostile, you don't know who's gonna be friendly, and it always keeps you on your toe because any little mention of something going on, it could flip in a moment's notice, and that was honestly unnerving on its own. And it pulls on those elements of gore and shock value of just really making you feel unsettled in your environment and ultimately helpless in your environment. Whereas, you know, the monster in previous games would come up to you and be like, and then you're like, oh, you're dead. No, you would encounter these things and they would majorly alter how the character progressed. And that just makes you feel so helpless, and just the feeling of you need to run away, you need to escape, just gets ramped up so much more in Outlast. There's also the DLC, The Whistleblower, which is extremely good in my opinion because it kind of delves in deeper on some of the lore behind the whole hospital. The moment that stands out for me the most was when you get strapped down by Eddie Glueskin, a serial killer who is about to mutilate your genitals to make you his perfect bride. And because this is kind of like you're strapped into the chair and it is from a first-person perspective, just being along for that ride is one of the most unsettling things ever, honestly, that I've ever experienced in a horror game at all. And I don't think that games have really recaptured that magic of just that feeling of just ickiness and helplessness of Outlast. It's funny because like you can see my physical body tensing up in describing this. Like the memories are so strong for me.
I know the fair sex often endure the same wounds with more suffering, but you really need to make an effort.
But then of course we do reach the pinnacle of the horror walking simulator genre in PT releasing just the year after Outlast. How do you even describe PT? I use a basic outline as a script to kind of put these videos together, and just trying to map out PT in a quick summary, I was finding it really difficult. But I'm going to do my best. PT stands for playable teaser for a game called Silent Hills, which was a Hideo Kojima and Konami collaboration, and it was supposed to like reinvigorate the whole Silent Hill franchise. This thing was extremely mysterious. It just kind of launched on the PSN store where it was like PT, oh, Hideo Kojima, oh, I should go check this out. And turns out it was absolutely horrifying, releasing on the PlayStation Store in August of 2014. Essentially, this, I think, fits probably into the haunted house simulator the best because you're just stuck in this loop of a couple of hallways inside of this house, and every single time you go through this loop, more unexplained horrors start to pop up, and everything that you thought that you knew slowly gets warped and distorted in very creepy ways. It's kind of the ultimate haunted house experience, if you will, as the jump scares are kind of inevitable but unpredictable, and solving the game almost feels impossible as things get more and more deranged and decayed as you're going through this thing until it just comes back to normalcy. But turns out that was all a farce. It really plays with the player's expectations of what they think they're doing, and that is something that is extremely well done. This is one of the greatest horror games of all time. If you look on like any like top 10 horror game lists, even excluding, like, even outside of just horror walking simulators, I'm just talking horror games, the umbrella term, PT is almost guaranteed to be on every single list. And it was just, once again, like a 1 to 3 hour experience of a free game on the PlayStation Store. What I really liked about PT was that as you keep on looping, something that feels so familiar gets twisted and there's evil around every single corner, or maybe there's nothing there at all. And with each loop, you just don't know what's going to happen next. It slowly increases its tension by changing things that are familiar, and then you just don't simply know what to be looking out for until you're just looking out for everything. And then at that point, it's got you in its trap, and it can kind of just open the floodgates of just absolutely terrifying you with every single element that could possibly exist. And a lot of this too is just because of the attention to detail that was done for PT, with the ghost randomly appearing in different areas, just watching over you, or maybe it's outside the window. It's not in your face where you're like, oh, I'm supposed to see this because this is scripted. These things can just randomly happen. And while you're just going through it, trying to figure out what you're supposed to be doing next, you look in the window and you're like, holy shit, the ghost is just there. The ghost is just hanging. It's that subtleness and unnervingness that just starts very slow, but then as it increases, the tension increases, making the player feel more and more and more unnerved and just uncomfortable with the environment. I think actually there's a quote saying that they were aiming for like looping mental anguish. So yeah, they achieved that pretty damn well. But the sad part of this story is that because of the whole Hideo Kojima and Konami breakup in 2015, the game was completely erased, removed from everywhere, and so you can't play this game in its purest form. It simply just doesn't exist. But in a weird way, that almost adds to its legend, adds to its myth, because This is now just something that you can read about or watch, and there are like fan games that exist out there trying to recreate the experience, but you're never going to get the pure product in its entirety. And I will say, it is the best instance I have ever experienced about one of those look behind you jump scares. It was so well executed in this game that it still sends shivers down my spine. I cannot express how well this game was put together.
I said, look behind you, like you were chanting some strange spell. There was another family shot to death in December last year. His rifle and meat cleaver to murder his entire family. In each case, the perpetrator.
And for me, I think that kind of lays the groundwork for all of the horror walking simulators. Whether or not you're talking about Amnesia, whether or not you're talking about Outlast, Slender, or PT, these 4 games were really important in making the genre what it is today. And there are quite a few other games out there that really recreated this feeling and honestly do a really good job in the genre, like Layers of Fear, Alien Isolation, honestly even the Resident Evil 7 demo, it felt very PT in nature, and I think they nailed it there too. But I am curious what the next big breakout horror walking simulator game is going to be, because honestly, with some of the sequels, I was a little bit disappointed. Outlast 2 was pretty good, but it never really reached that same level that I think Outlast did. And the same could be said about Amnesia. I'm really waiting for another game to kind of come out and really just take me by storm, really put me back into that sense of horror that I first experienced when playing through a lot of these golden age horror walking simulator games. But now I want to hear from you. What are your favorite horror walking simulator games? Did I miss any of them within this genre? I mean, I'm looking at the years 2010 to 2014 here, which I think was kind of the foundation, the start of all of that. But genuinely, if I did miss any of these experiences, I want to know, because I want to dip in and experience a lot of these things. There's something here about being like, oh, video games is art and all that type of stuff, but I'm not going to go into that argument, because genuinely, if you put together a damn good horror video game, they're damn good, and I feel like a lot of these games really are. Okay, that about wraps it up for this video. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and you know what? We'll catch you in the next one. Thank you for sticking around, and we'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.